The movie starts with several SWAT team members gathering after a mission. The team includes James, Cliff, Sam, and Walter. They brought their wives and female friends. One of the women is Stacy, a famous journalist and an old friend of James. James chats with Stacy for a while, and then his older brother, Walter, gets a phone call. Walter looks worried and quickly goes inside the house with the phone. James follows him, curious about what is happening. Walter says everything is fine and that he will handle it himself. Then, he goes home with his wife. In the evening, James is relaxing when his phone rings. It's Walter's wife, who tells him that Walter has died. James rushes to Walter's house and finds that Walter has been killed with a cut on his neck. When James returns home, he gets a call from Cliff, who is in danger and asks for help. James rushes to Cliff's apartment, but arrives too late. Cliff has also been killed with a similar cut. James checks Cliff's phone and finds a message from someone named Bill O'Brien. He decides to search Cliff's apartment further. When he enters a room, he is attacked. Fortunately, James fights back and defeats the attacker. He then interrogates the man to find out who he is and who he works for, but the man refuses to talk. James shot the man in the leg and asked him again for information, but the man cursed at him. James then shot him dead, knowing he wouldn't get any answers. James went to see his best friend, Lieutenant Ross, who was also Walter and Cliff's boss during the war in Afghanistan. He told Ross that Walter and Cliff were dead, but Ross advised him to leave the investigation to the police. Filled with revenge, James ignored Ross's advice. He decided to find the killers of Walter and Cliff himself. He asked Ross if he knew someone named Bill O'Brien. Ross said he did. Bill was one of his men in Afghanistan and fought in the war with them. As James was about to leave, Cliff's cell phone rang. The caller was Bill O'Brien, but when James answered, the call was disconnected. This made James more certain that O'Brien was involved in the deaths of Cliff and Walter. Meanwhile, a businessman named Ted Bomer hired the best hitman, Ray, to find the stolen $40 million. He told Ray to start his search with Lieutenant Ross. Ray went to Ross and asked who had stolen the money. Ross said it was Walter and Cliff, and that he had killed them both. They concluded that the $40 million must be with James. Stacy visits James at his house. Soon after, two people knock on the door. They claim to be officers checking gas in every home. James lets them in. It turns out they are soldiers. James already suspected they were sent to arrest him. His instincts were correct. With Stacy's help, he defeats them both. He then finds their identity cards on their bodies. Ross hears that the two men he sent were killed by James. He hacks into military databases to find information about O'Brien and eventually traces his address. Meanwhile, James calls Sam and tells him to be careful. In the evening, James arrives at O'Brien's empty house. Soon after, he sees some suspicious people trying to sneak in. He realizes they are there to catch him. Using his military and fighting skills, he manages to kill them all. After this incident, Ross and Ray think hard about how to kill James and get the money back. They still don't know where the money is. To make James reveal the location of the money, they plan to take Sam into custody. In the afternoon, James meets Sam to look for O'Brien. Before they leave, James needs to use the restroom. As he enters, someone with a syringe follows him. Luckily, James catches the man before he can inject him. James asks who sent him, but the man says his boss will kill his family if he talks. Without waiting, James injects the man with the syringe. After that, James gets information from his military friends and goes to a bar where O'Brien is known to go. O'Brien is there. When James asks about him, some people in the bar tell him to leave. James leaves, but not before fighting some of them. O'Brien then gets into his car. But James is waiting inside, pointing a gun at O'Brien's head. James asks about his connection with Cliff and Walter. O'Brien says he was their friend. O'Brien explains that while in Afghanistan, Lieutenant Ross invited him to join an illegal operation to smuggle drugs from Afghanistan to America by hiding them in the bodies of dead soldiers. Cliff and Walter were forced to join this operation. They wanted to quit, but Ross wouldn't let them because they were too involved. They continued the illegal work until one day, they stole all the money from the operation to use as evidence of the crime. Hearing this, James asks O'Brien to take him to the place where the operations are run. That evening, James, O'Brien, and Sam go to a warehouse. They get out while Sam stays in the car to keep watch. Silently, James knocked out the guards one by one outside. Then he and O'Brien sneaked inside and split up to look for evidence. After some time searching, James found a pile of drugs ready to be distributed in America. Unfortunately, O'Brien was caught by one of Ross's men and was shot dead. Hearing the gunshots, James looked toward the sound. He quickly shot the person who had killed O'Brien. At the same time, Ross arrived with the rest of his men. They captured poor Sam, who was still on guard in the car. Ross and some of his men entered the building to arrest James, and a gunfight broke out. Luckily, James managed to escape from the warehouse. Later that night, one of Ross's men left the building and headed home. James followed him to his house. He approached the man and asked who Ross had ordered to execute Walter. James threatened the man, saying he would kill his family if he didn't talk. Frightened, the man revealed that Hammond, Lieutenant Ross's right-hand man, had executed Walter. After getting the information, James shot the man in the head. The next day, Ross calls James and offers to exchange Sam for the stolen money. James doesn't know where the money is, but he agrees to the deal anyway. Unfortunately, Ross breaks his promise. During the exchange, his men kill Sam. Before James can react, they shoot him too. James is taken to a place to be tortured. The man torturing him says he is Hammond, the one who killed Walter. James also sees Ray, someone he knew from his time in the Special Forces. He didn't expect Ray to become a hitman. Ray asks James where the stolen money is, but James still won't tell. So, Ross's men show him Walter's wife, who they have taken hostage, making James panic. He admits that he doesn't know anything about the money. He only pretended to know to save Sam. Moments later, Ross arrives at the building, and his men rush out to greet him. James uses this opportunity to free his hands. When Hammond returns, James is ready. He hits Hammond with a wooden block and kills him. Then, he kills all of Ross's men. James takes his sister-in-law to safety. Then, he faces Ray and Ross, calling them disgraces to the country. Ray says that being a soldier made his life miserable, with no rewards or money after risking his life in battle. After mocking each other, they start shooting. Ray tries to find a chance to shoot James and let Ross escape. They have a shootout, but in the end, James shoots Ray in the chest, killing him. James then chases Ross, who is trying to get away. The chase ends when James corners Ross. With no other option, Ross has to fight James. James is cornered several times, especially when Ross uses a knife while James only has his bare hands. But in the end, James manages to kill Lieutenant Ross. Afterward, he and his sister-in-law leave the place. At the end of the film, James tells Stacy to report on Lieutenant Ross and his illegal activities so similar incidents won't happen again. Then, he remembers the yard that Cliff had trampled. Curious, he digs it up and finds a savings account worth $40 million in his name. He is shocked, not expecting that Walter had planned this from the start. James decides to use some of the money to help war veterans. So the moral of the story is if you're ever in a sticky situation, always dig up your yard. You might find a cool $40 million and a crazy backstory to boot.